Shoujo anime is dying. That's been the discourse circulating around the internet lately, and with more and more shoujo manga being sidelined in favor of animating stories that might appeal to a larger audience, and shoujo publishing magazines losing out during an online reading transition, a lot of people are wondering if these stories have the ability to step out of the shonen shadow. There are some shoujo series that are being animated, no doubt, but they're much fewer and further between, and they tend not to see the same love and attention as their shonen counterparts. This might be due in part to women being quote-unquote more willing to watch shows made for men than vice versa, but honestly, I'm not sure that's the case. In my opinion, the bigger cause for the decline in anime targeted towards female audiences is largely for two reasons. The first reason is that shoujo manga is not as easy to access legally, especially in the West. Compared to shonen manga, shoujo manga often does not receive the same amount of love when it comes to international distribution. There's an amazing video by Colleen Manga Rex that outlines the rise and fall of shoujo beat. This video outlines a lot of the reasons why this might be happening, so I'll link it in the description down below. But essentially, since shonen is easier to access legally online, especially when it comes to translations, the anime industry might mistakenly believe that the shonen industry has more reach than the shoujo one. Applications such as Shonen Jump Plus introduce swaths of people to shonen titles, while shoujo titles don't see a similar opportunity. Studios may see differences in performance numbers between the demographics and wrongly assume that the differences are purely due to the content created. With more perceived potential in one demographic than the other, studios may want to animate the shonen stories with more potential growth and neglect the shoujo stories that might even be selling at a similar rate. The second reason for this decline is that shoujo animes tend to have smaller budgets. These smaller budgets lead to less advertising for the television series as a whole, and in turn lead to smaller audiences. Smaller audiences for shoujo shows tell studios that shoujo is less profitable and thereby not worth investing in. This incentivizes studios to cut funding for shoujo even further. Ultimately, it seems like there's a vicious cycle going on here that would be difficult to break unless there's a big change. And I think that change might be here. Why Raeliana Ended Up at the Duke's Mansion is a new anime title coming out on April 10th of this year. It's about a girl who gets isekai'd into a fantasy world as a side character in a novel. Her death is supposed to spur on key elements and scenes in the novel, so in an attempt to escape her fate, she uses information from the novel to scheme her way into a fake relationship with the novel's male protagonist. Ultimately, it's an action fantasy rom-com that has similar elements to shows like My Next Life as a Villainess, and I think that this show might be the stepping stone that shoujo needs to revive itself. What makes Raeliana special is that it's based off of a manhwa and not a manga. If you don't already know, manhwas are Korean comic-style stories that are similar to manga. For clarification purposes, I want to point out that we're spelling manhwas M-A-N-H-W-A-S as opposed to M-A-N-H-U-A-S, which are basically similar styled stories that are mostly coming from China. Chinese manhwas tend to get animated by Chinese animation studios as opposed to Japanese ones, so that's a whole other story. Anyways, many manhwas today are typically made to be consumed digitally as webcomics as opposed to on paper, thereby increasing their reach dramatically. They are an up-and-coming form of media due to their quick accessibility. This means that stories like these can compete on more fair ground with titles that are coming out on Jump Plus. However, applications and platforms that publish these webcomics and manhwa tend to operate a bit differently than their Japanese manga counterparts. Namely, webcomic applications such as Webtoon, Tappytoon, and Tapas are all self-publishing apps, meaning that, for the most part, there aren't middlemen interfering and making decisions on whether or not to publish a story. What ends up being promoted is largely due to feedback coming directly from the user base. Shonen Jump recently launched a similar application called Manga Plus that boasts a similar setup, but as of right now, it's not quite as established as its manhwa-toting counterparts. Big manhwa applications like Webtoon are receiving hundreds of millions of views on their popular titles. And while Tappytoon, the English language application where Raeliana can be found, isn't seeing that same success, the Korean one, Kakao Page, certainly is. Currently, Raeliana has 190 million views on Kakao Page. Views go by chapter, so if we consider that Raeliana has 158 chapters, that means that it's been read by about 1.2 million people on Kakao Page. That's actually comparable to the number one most popular manhwa on my anime list, Solo Leveling, which has been read by about 2 million people on Kakao Page. These numbers can also somewhat even stand up to manga sales for many popular series such as Fairy Tail, Seven Deadly Sins, Fruits Basket, and many others. However, one major thing that these numbers are failing to calculate is what could be the most game-changing aspect of all: piracy. Since webcomics are primarily distributed digitally, that is the main way everyone is obtaining it, even if they love the series and prefer hard copies. With digital copies of the novel pouring into the hands of the entire fan base, that makes creating pirates of the series that much easier. There are countless websites made just to pirate these stories, and some of these websites receive hundreds of millions of visitors each month. This means that these stories likely have huge sleeper audiences that sales figures can't even calculate. Now, I'm not saying this isn't a common occurrence in the manga community as well, but since manga readers are able to obtain hard copies of manga much more easily, not as many people within the fan bases of a story will necessarily have an easy way to post or translate the story illegally. So, ultimately, I believe that going forward, piracy will both cause bigger problems as well as create unexpectedly bigger audience disparities in the manhwa community. Like, straight up, a 10-year-old could screenshot any manhwa they're reading and post it to a piracy site. It's that easy. So, getting back to Raeliana. Sorta. The reason why Raeliana ended up at the Duke's mansion, or rather, why Raeliana ended up at the Duke's mansion, as the name was shortened slightly, isn't the first manhwa to be animated. Other fairly big manhwa titles, such as Tower of God, God of High School, and Noblesse, have also received Japanese animation adaptations in the past. And some more big manhwa titles, such as Solo Leveling and Dr. Elise, are slated to get animes in the future. However, Raeliana stands apart as a potential turning point for shoujo since it's marketed mainly towards girls, as opposed to the ones that have come out already, which were marketed towards boys. Ultimately, that's really it. Webcomic services have demographics with a fairly high number of women, perhaps not necessarily more women than men, but still a high number of women nonetheless. For female manhwa readers, Raeliana happens to be a pretty popular title. And Raeliana, being a manhwa, is unaffected by the disparity in shoujo versus shonen manga marketing. Therefore, it has a fighting chance to break the cycle. Not to mention, Raeliana just happens to be a really entertaining story, start to finish. It's well written, well drawn, and hopefully, it'll be well animated. The story itself isn't vastly different from other manhwas within the same genres, but it doesn't really need to be. The characters are endearing and their interactions feel realistic. It creates funny and entertaining scenarios without having to over-rely on overused tropes like misunderstandings. The story is a romance, but it has a lot of fast-paced action and complex situations packed into it. The main character is strong-willed, decisive, and can hold her own, but she doesn't possess vast amounts of overpowered buffs. I've read this story 3 times, and it was entertaining each time. Personally, I think that the unexpected popularity the show may end up getting might light a fire in anime studios to seek out more stories like it, in both manhwa and manga forms alike. The possible attention this show could receive might just lead to new and unexpected traction in the shoujo sphere, and we can only hope that gives shoujo as a whole a new and more secure foothold in the animation industry. Or maybe the show will have no effect whatsoever. Either way, though, the reason why Raeliana ended up at the Duke's mansion was a great story, and I'm just happy it got an animation.